NC pork, good for the plate, great for the state. Coming up on this edition of the David Glenn Show, Carolina hires an NBA champion and lands a 7-foot reclassifying prospect from overseas. NC State starts over. Duke reloads with the #1 class in the country, and Wake Forest essentially fields a brand new team. Plus, High Point coming off the first NCAA tournament win in program history, the rule change that's about to alter every college basketball roster in America, the NCAA tournament getting bigger, the Big 12's blockbuster new private capital deal, and why your favorite team's most important player next year might be from Mali, Slovakia, or Australia. Strap in.
Covering the bold North State. The players. The coaches. The legends. The fans. The most trusted sports journalist in North Carolina. This is the David Glenn Show on the North Carolina Sports Network.
Welcome in, everybody. Mike Waddell here on the North Carolina Sports Network, alongside the man who has covered the ACC longer and better than just about anyone in the business, David Glenn. And this is the way too early 26-27 college basketball edition of the David Glenn Show. Before we get into it, if you're watching us on YouTube, do me a favor and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell so you get notified every time we drop a new show. If you're listening on the podcast side, take 10 seconds, leave a 5-star rating, write a quick review, share the episode with somebody who you love and who loves college sports. It is the single biggest way that you can help the North Carolina Sports Network grow this thing. So go ahead. Follow us, the North Carolina Sports Network, across all social. Follow the David Glenn Show. And right now, let's get to it. Welcome back, David. We've had a little bit of a break following the Final Four, but it's always a good time to talk basketball with you, my friend.
Yeah, Mike, it's great to be with you. Thanks for your support all year long through this past academic year and through the conclusion of the NCAA tournament. We used to be able to have these conversations about next year soon after the conclusion of the previous college basketball year. Now it takes a lot longer for all the pieces to fall into place, but we have finally reached the point here in North Carolina and across the ACC where all of these coaches pretty much know at least 10 or more of the 15 slots that will be filled on next year's men's basketball roster. So in that sense, this is the perfect time to do this show, and I'm glad you're a part of it.
David, 4 programs in our backyard, every one of them with a different storyline. Let's start with the Tar Heels because that's the hire, the headline of the entire off season. Michael Malone, NBA champion with the Denver Nuggets, hadn't coached at the college level since he was an assistant with Manhattan back in 2001. From your seat, almost 40 years covering the ACC. When's the last time that we've had a swing this big at Carolina? And what's your read on it?
Well, Mike, it depends on your perspective because I would call it a big swing for Carolina basketball, for example, when they hired Roy Williams in the early 2000s. Now, you could say that one deserves an asterisk. He was already a proven head coach with the Kansas Jayhawks. Of course, he ends up leading the Tar Heels to 3 NCAA titles. That was almost a quarter century ago at this point. That was a pretty big swing for Carolina, and it worked out really, really, really well. Only UConn has more NCAA titles here in the 21st century than Carolina's 3 under Roy Williams. And of course, Michael Malone has been hired to get the Tar Heels back to competing for championships, not just making the NCAA tournament, but getting another elusive ACC title, reaching another Final Four, and eventually cutting down the nets. Prior to Roy Williams, you might have to go back, Mike, to before you and I were born. I mean, it's funny that Michael Malone is a New Yorker because way back in the 1950s, UNC went outside the family to hire Frank McGuire, who was coming off a trip to the national championship game at St. John's. So you'd have to call that a big swing in the 1950s, and that one worked out well. The Heels won it all in 1957 under Frank McGuire, the fiery New Yorker who had already proven himself as a head coach at the college level in that case. Michael Malone, of course, has proven himself as a head coach at the NBA level, as you mentioned. Not just that NBA title, but he built 7 consecutive playoff caliber teams with the Denver Nuggets. So this is a huge swing for Carolina basketball, for Carolina athletics. We all know that they would have hired a college guy if they could, Tommy Lloyd of Arizona or Dusty May of Michigan. That didn't work out. So they took a big swing in a different way. And starting in year 1 under these new rules, Mike, you know there's no more grace period. The Tar Heels are expected to be really good in year 1 under Michael Malone. I think they will be good, but how good is a matter of debate that we'll explore a little bit today.
It's going to look like an entirely new Carolina team out on the floor again this year. Last year, less than a handful of Tar Heels coming back from the previous season. This year, Henri Veesaar has now declared for the draft, and Carolina has gone overseas for a really talented and highly respected big man.
Yeah, that's true. And we're still working on some of these pronunciations, especially for the foreign guys. And folks can visit our website, ncsportsnetwork.com, for all of these details, not only on all 18 ACC men's basketball programs, but all 19 Division I teams here in the great state of North Carolina. But this young man's name is Sayon Keita, and we'll revise that pronunciation if he tells us so when he arrives in Chapel Hill. But Sayon Keita is a 7-foot, 215-pound big man who has been for the last 4 years playing for FC Barcelona, which is one of the top basketball pro clubs in all of Europe. Now, in that format, you don't always play for the top team. So he's only gotten a few minutes with the top team of FC Barcelona, but maybe more exciting for Carolina fans to hear, he played a lot of minutes over there in what they would call their under-22 league. So top FC Barcelona would be grown men, right? Anywhere from 20 years old to 40 years old and everywhere in between. Not everybody's ready for that. So just like the NBA has the G League, in Europe, they often have these, sometimes they're called under-22 leagues. So Sayon Keita, not a big scorer. Any Carolina fan picturing him as, the true replacement for Henri Veesaar at both ends of the floor is going to be disappointed. Unlike a lot of European imports, Mike, remember Tess DeRitter of UVA was 23 years old last year after playing internationally for a while. He's from Belgium. Sayon Keita is only 18 years old. So that's the expectations for physical maturity, emotional maturity, and just more of a man's body should be lower for Keita than a guy like Veesaar, who was playing in his 4th year of college basketball, remember, at Carolina a year ago after 3 years in the Arizona Wildcats program. But Sayon Keita is viewed as a possible first-round draft pick in next year's NBA draft. So on the one hand, his long-term upside is fantastic, and it's a credit to Michael Malone and his staff that they had a need in the post when Veesaar made his NBA decision, and they plugged it to at least some degree with Keita pretty quickly. But again, in terms of expectations, Keita is ready to be a shot blocker in the Atlantic Coast Conference. He is ready to be a rebounder and defender in the Atlantic Coast Conference. He is not ready to be the sometimes 20 points per game guy that Henri Veesaar was. So Carolina's, they're not done building their roster, but at least the roster we know right now, Keita is likely the starter in the post, but he will be much more of a defender and rebounder as a freshman for the Tar Heels than he will be any kind of an offensively versatile star at that end of the floor. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Carolina has some good guards, some good wings, and maybe Michael Malone's first team will be built, in that kind of a light where even though UNC is famous for its post scorers over many decades throughout our entire lifetimes, it doesn't look like Michael Malone's first team is going to have that in Chapel Hill. There's more than one road to the top of the mountain, of course, and the Tar Heels are just going to have to build in a different manner as we explore the rest of their first-year roster under Malone.
Were you surprised that Veesaar left Chapel Hill after only a year, especially considering the end of the season that he enjoyed along with the Tar Heels and then Coach Hubert Davis?
I wasn't surprised in one sense, but I was surprised in another. And this is crazy, a crazy aspect of modern college basketball. Obviously, Henri Veesaar has been in college for 4 years. He played in Europe as a young man, recruited to one of the top clubs in Europe out of Estonia. He's one of the most famous players already in the history of the country of Estonia. He's got a lot of ball under his belt. And when you get a little bit older, sometimes you just want to turn the page and you want to become a true pro without, the burden, if you want to call it that, of academic responsibilities in the college lifestyle. What I was intrigued to follow was that in today's world, Mike, and this sounds crazy, I know, but these are round numbers, okay? If Henri Veesaar is selected in this summer's NBA draft, let's just say toward the end of the first round, you get a slotted compensation level. You and your agent, it's not like you're negotiating in the marketplace, right? It is a slotted number. You know what the slotted numbers are like toward the end of the first round? Let's just call it ballpark, $3 million a year, guaranteed for 2 years, okay? Now, that's a very compelling number, right? In today's college basketball world, I am 100% certain that both the Tar Heels and other colleges would have paid Henri Veesaar more than the $3 million he's going to get. More. So you and I have discussed for years now how Armando Bacot, remember, was making more money in his latter years as a big fella for the Tar Heels than he could have made as an undrafted free agent in pro basketball. That's how the economics have changed. Well, Veesaar is an example of the reverse. He could have made more in college, but he chose to turn pro anyway. That's fascinating. That means, it's more than just a money decision. And of course, if you're making $3 million a year in the NBA in terms of your compensation from your pro team, you can supplement that with endorsements and other things. So maybe the dollars end up being similar to what Henri could have made if he stayed with the Tar Heels or picked a different college team. But that's an extremely different approach or prism that you have to look through as a talented veteran college player. That was not the case 5 years ago. That was not the case 10 years ago. That wasn't the case 20 or 50 years ago. Henri Veesaar made more of a personal decision than a financial decision. I think he was just ready to turn the page and challenge himself at the very highest level of basketball that the world has to offer, that being the National Basketball Association.
The people around basketball that I talked to were not surprised at all. They said if he's going to start over again, and he was going to start over with Malone and the majority of new coaches in Chapel Hill, that you might as well go ahead and get your clock rolling and get to the NBA. And again, he had such a great end of the season, David, that his stock has to be at an all-time high, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, and part of Michael Malone's job, remember, is, and we're going to get into this theme with a lot of others, the number of coaches in the ACC that lost either 4 or all 5 of the starters from the previous year's team is sky high. There are a few exceptions. Duke and UVA have multiple starters back, just to give a couple of quick examples. But Jaren Stevenson is the only returning starter for the Tar Heels. And you're talking about Henri Veesaar's NBA stock. Remember that Caleb Wilson is going to be a top 5 pick off of last year's Tar Heels team under Hubert Davis. So obviously with the coaching transition, the chemistry is a little different. Everybody was going to be brand new, no matter who stayed and who left. But Carolina, coming off an NCAA tournament season under Hubert Davis that didn't reach the levels that they had hoped, they're going to have to figure out a way to be as good or better without the 2 most talented guys on last year's roster, Caleb Wilson and Henri Veesaar.
Before we move on, let me ask you to look back into your DG basketball crystal ball. And 1 year ago at this time, you were telling us that the ACC's top 6 teams would include, in some order, Duke, Virginia, Louisville, UNC, and Miami. And all 5 of those teams went on to post top 6 ACC finishes and made the NCAA tournament. You also told us 1 year ago that Boston College, Pitt and Wake Forest were headed for difficult seasons, and that also proved to be the case. So with your David Glenn Show crystal ball in mind, what's your way too early projection for the 2026-27 Tar Heels?
Yeah, Mike, thanks for that history lesson. It makes me feel better about the things that I got wrong a year ago as you and I do this fun show every year. But here's my kind of 60,000 feet view. I believe Michael Malone has definitely built an NCAA tournament caliber roster in year one in Chapel Hill. So that means, if in an 18-team ACC, do I believe the Tar Heels are in the top third, meaning one of the top six? Yes, I do, with the roster they've already assembled. However, it remains to be seen how the pieces are going to fit together for the Tar Heels, specifically in the backcourt. We mentioned earlier that Jaren Stevenson is back as a multi-talented forward. We mentioned that Sayon Keita is the young 18-year-old 7-footer who can rebound and block shots. We know there's a McDonald's All-American on the way in Chapel Hill in Maximo Adams. He plays on the wing. We know that NC State's freshman of a year ago, Matt Abel, a really good shooter and a very efficient player on the wing, he's headed to Chapel Hill. Those are nice pieces. It's one of the reasons I feel that the Tar Heels have, a preseason top 25 caliber team. But two guys whose names I haven't mentioned yet, I think are going to be the key to the season, and Michael Malone and that new UNC staff are going to have to build with these two guys in mind. Virginia Tech's guard, Avdalas, played point guard most of the time for the Hokies last year. So when Carolina fans read that a 6'9" guy from Virginia Tech, Avdalas, is coming to Chapel Hill, sometimes they'll just think of him as a forward, okay? When they see that 6'3" Utah guard, Terrence Brown, is coming to Chapel Hill, they might assume that he is automatically a point guard. Neither is the case. The 6'9" Avdalas views, and he's an NBA prospect on the radar to be a future NBA draft pick. He views himself as a point guard, and he did have twice as many assists as turnovers last year with the Hokies, but he was not a very efficient player. Essentially, Mike Young, veteran coach at Virginia Tech, had a talented roster in Blacksburg a year ago, and they won some games, but the pieces just never fit together. And where Avdalas was a double-digit scorer, and he had, close to 150 assists, he never made the machine work efficiently. Either the Hokies collectively or his own personal numbers were better on volume than they were on efficiency. Well, similarly, when you read 6'3" Utah guard Terrence Brown, and the guy was honorable mention all Big 12. Again, this is a talented roster Michael Malone has in Chapel Hill in year one. Terrence Brown has never in his 3-year college career had twice as many assists as turnovers. He is much more of a driver on the wing. But anybody thinking, Ed Cota prototype point guard who gets the ball up floor quickly and distributes it, little guy who might have a 3 or 4 to 1 assist turnover ratio. No, that is not Terrence Brown. In fact, Terrence Brown 2 years ago was one of the top 10 scorers in the entire nation when he played at Fairleigh Dickinson University in one of the smaller leagues. He averaged more than 20 points per game, but he was not the true point guard at Fairleigh Dickinson. He was not a true point guard at Utah either. So the 6'3" guy is more of a driver on the wing, and the 6'9" guy views himself as a point guard. Now, most importantly, how does Michael Malone view these guys? How is Michael Malone going to make the puzzle pieces fit together? We know what Matt Abel and Maximo Adams can do on the wing. We know what Jaren Stevenson can do at forward. We have an idea of what Sayon Keita can do as a defense and rebounding first center. And there are other pieces coming back to Chapel Hill as well. But priority number one is, who does Michael Malone see as the point guard? How does Michael Malone view Terrence Brown, who is super quick, and he's really good at driving into the lane, and he's very good at finding open teammates, and he's very good at getting to the foul line for a 6'3" guy. He makes almost 80% of his free throws, which obviously is a good number. But it's I keep seeing Carolina fans writing Terrence Brown, point guard, Neo Avdalas, wing forward as you do your depth chart. I don't think it's that simple. In fact, I think that's an upside down way of viewing where those players have been, how they view themselves, what are their skill sets. And it's up to Michael Malone to make sure those pieces fit together. Because if you don't have good backcourt chemistry, you're not going to have a great team. But if somehow you use the 6'9", 215-pound Neo Avdalas in a point guard capacity that enables Terrence Brown to be the wing scorer and the wing driver, maybe they both maximize their potential. Maybe the chemistry in Chapel Hill is better than the chemistry was in Blacksburg a year ago at Virginia Tech. But those two guys you're going to kind of need to get a bunch of cooks in the kitchen and cook something up that maximizes the productivity of an unorthodox combination at guard for the Tar Heels. When the Heels have had great backcourt chemistry over the years, sensational things have happened, right? Just think of your favorite point guard, wing guard combination. If it's Ty Lawson and Wayne Ellington, right? That chemistry was not a problem. There was also a year more recently where Caleb Love and RJ Davis, two individually talented players, never found a positive chemistry, and the Tar Heels season was derailed as a result. Keep your eye on the 6'9" Neo Avdalas, the 6'3" Terrence Brown. Don't make assumptions based on their height about what their track record suggests that they can bring to the Tar Heels. That's Michael Malone's number one challenge. And number two, of course, is hoping that 18-year-old newcomers like Maximo Adams from the high school ranks and Sayon Keita from the international talent pool, they need to grow up quickly because in all likelihood, they're both going to need to play a lot of minutes for the Tar Heels in the 2026-27 season.
David, kudos to you because you are machine gunning these new names like you've known these kids, like you're a summer camp counselor. And as we get closer to summer here, you'll see staffs start to take shape. Well, for Malone, he's not coached in college in a quarter century. He has Chuck Martin on his staff. But aside from Chuck Martin, there's nobody new other than Malone and Chuck Martin. Kim English was here, then he was gone very quickly for the Tar Heels. The only people that are missing from the Tar Heels sideline are Hubert Davis, Brad Frederick, and Jeff Lebo. Everybody else is back. So I guess I've got to ask you this one kind of out of left field. So are you telling me that the only problems with Carolina basketball were Hubert Davis, Jeff Lebo, and Brad Frederick? Because it just seems kind of odd right now, and that's not really fair. I'm putting on my AD hat for a second, walking into my coach's office and saying, what are you thinking here? Not criticizing, just trying to understand.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair question. I will say that Chuck Martin was universally celebrated. I mean, you and I have sources in college basketball. We have sources in the NBA. Every person I trust at either of those levels talked about how smart Michael Malone was to hire Coach Martin as one of his assistants. They did work together, more than a quarter century ago at the college level. But Coach Martin has been an elite recruiter for John Calipari, I think, at 3 different schools. Most recently, obviously, Arkansas. And whereas some of those same sources that I've trusted talked about Hubert Davis not having what they called a bulldog recruiter, somebody who just has connections, but also talent evaluation skills. Chuck Martin has that combination, and it's well documented over decades. So Michael Malone, as he should, taps into an old relationship, lures him away from John Calipari's staff at Arkansas, and already you can see some of the handiwork as they have built this talented roster. Remember, Mike, in previous years, somebody thought Kyan Evans would be a starting caliber point guard for the North Carolina Tar Heels. Now, we all make mistakes, but if I were evaluating whatever assistant coach looked into his crystal ball and said, yeah, I think Kyan Evans would be a starting caliber point guard at a North Carolina program that claims it's trying to compete for championships. That's delusional. Like, that's a fireable offense if you make those mistakes frequently enough. We all make talent evaluation mistakes. I used to go to Nike and Adidas camps. I got most guys right who I thought would turn out well in the ACC, but did I completely whiff on a whole bunch of others? Of course. You can't whiff on cornerstones, right? The North Carolina program, to a great degree, has excelled the most when point and post are filled correctly, right? Doesn't have to be both superstars. You know, Derek Phelps on the 1993 Tar Heels with Eric Montross as the elite veteran post player. That was good enough to win a national championship, even though Phelps was more of a distributor and a defensive guy. And Eric Montross was not, was not like a future NBA star, elite college player, rest his soul, old friend of the program. But you get the point. Something broke down on Hubert Davis's staff, whether it was recruiting somebody from the Ivy League early in his tenure and believing that Paxson Wojcik was going to be a starting caliber player in the ACC. Again, nobody bats 100% on talent evaluation. You can't miss that frequently when it comes to players you're expecting to start for you. Michael Malone, I can promise you, Neo Avdalas is an ACC caliber player. He's already proven it at Virginia Tech. Terrence Brown is an ACC caliber player. Jaron Stevenson is back. Matt Abel at NC State, absolutely, as a freshman, proved he is an ACC caliber player. Getting Maximo Adams, who had been committed to Hubert Davis's staff, to stay with the Tar Heels is another win. The accumulation of talent is there. Again, Malone's challenge is making the pieces fit together in a way I described just a short time ago. With Hubert Davis's staff, they didn't have a great bulldog recruiter. Now Michael Malone does. And man, some of their talent evaluation misses were massive misses, the type that prevented the Tar Heels from getting where they wanted to go.
Every great team has a winning playbook, and every great meal, it starts with North Carolina pork. Bacon for the early tip breakfast, pulled pork at the arena. That's how you win the day. Behind every bite, NC pig farmers fuel more than $10 billion in economic impact statewide. Great teams execute. Great meals deliver. North Carolina pork. Game on, grill on. Learn more at ncpork.org.
For our veterans, the end of their service is just the beginning. It may come with new careers and new chaos. There might be late nights, school drops, and even haircuts. That's where we come in, providing more than $1 million a year in career-building scholarship funds and discounts on every haircut for our veterans. Just trying to do our parts to make their lives a little easier. Sport Clips Haircuts, supporting veterans everywhere.
Lots of tectonic shifts in Chapel Hill, a different type of seismic event going on over in Raleigh as Will Wade was out on March 26th. Really 4 years ago, if you want to, debate about it. And a lot of people down on the Bayou and even here in the Triangle seem to think that this was a done deal a lot sooner than it was. And I will tell you, one source that I had that I don't know if it can get much closer to the situation told me that he felt like this was going to happen 4 years ago. Okay. And I trust that person pretty well because he was directly impacted by the hire. But in only 4 days, Boo Corrigan comes back with an alum, a home run hire with all of the feel-good people around Emilio's and Sammy's Tap and Grill, the Wolfpack faithful, Justin Gainey, fresh out of the High Point area and played high school ball for Freddie Johnson down at Greensboro Day. He is back in there. So walk us through what Gainey is building with as he now goes into the portal and tries to put together Wolfpack basketball here for 26-27.
Yeah, one quick asterisk here, Mike. Whereas a Brad Brownell at Clemson already knows, as we're conversing in the month of May, that 14 of the 15 slots on next year's roster are filled, right? He has the names and the details already lined up at this relatively early stage. Justin Gainey may have only 10 of those 15 filled at NC State. And that's why I say there's an asterisk, because we'll have to revisit his roster after a few more pieces fall into place. But I would say that Justin Gainey, who of course just worked for Rick Barnes at Tennessee, was the Volunteers defensive coordinator. So that'll be part of the foundation as he returns to his alma mater and builds the Wolfpack in his image. No Will Wade style concerns about Justin Gainey. He bleeds the right type of red, and nobody has to worry about his loyalty for obvious reasons. But one way to summarize Justin Gainey's approach with his new staff is that they have mostly plucked to the good side, all conference caliber players, but from the mid-major ranks as he builds his first Wolfpack team. For example, Preston Edmeade is the new point guard. You know, Justin Gainey is going to scrutinize his point guard prospects because that's what he played in a Wolfpack uniform for Herb Sendek back in the late 1990s. Preston Edmeade, A, is only going into his sophomore year of college, and B, was an all-conference player in the Coastal Athletic Association at Hofstra last year as a freshman. So that's a proven mid-major all-conference caliber point guard that likely will start for the Wolfpack in his first year in Raleigh. Similarly, on the wing, a guy named Christian Hammond. He was all West Coast Conference last year at Santa Clara as a sophomore. So he still has 2 years of eligibility. And in the post, Kyle Evans, all Big West Conference at Cal Irvine. It is a great sign when you are luring all conference caliber players from other Division I leagues. The one addendum to that is that most of the time, not all of the time, most of the transfers, Mike, who emerge as truly all ACC caliber talents, meaning one of those 15 names on the postseason first team, second team, or third team in the Atlantic Coast Conference, a large majority of them came from other power conference programs, sometimes even one ACC program transferring to another ACC program. Less frequently, it's these mid-major guys, even if they were all conference at their previous school, it's a big leap to go from the CAA to the ACC, from the West Coast Conference to the ACC, from the Big West Conference to the ACC. Now, those are good leagues, right? There's 31 conferences in America. If you sign a guy from, let's say, the bottom 10 leagues, it's going to be a really hard transition, and there are not going to be a lot of examples of guys signed from the bottom 10 leagues who became all ACC players. These guys at NC State are all from, let's call them the middle 10 leagues. The CAA is a good league. West Coast Conference, good league. Kyle Evans coming from the Big West. Good programs, right? Hofstra and Santa Clara and Cal Irvine. So those are three highlights. A guy named Emily Yalaho is a good forward they added from Washington State. You could call that a mid-major program nowadays. And then they have already gotten one guy from, he was a double-digit scorer in the Big Ten last season at Maryland. It is not easy to get guys who have averaged double figures in what we call the Power Five in men's basketball when you add the Big East. Darius Adams of the Maryland Terrapins averaged about 11 points per game. He's not a three-point shooter, but he is a good scorer. So that's another wing guy. So Justin Gainey, Preston Edmeade at point guard. You have Christian Hammond and Darius Adams on the wing. You have Yalaho at forward. You have Kyle Evans, the transfer I mentioned, in the post. And then you have some other guys on top of that. The other asterisk, Mike, is that as we have this show, the great sharpshooter, I mean, one of the best, purest three-point shooters in the entire country, Paul McNeil Jr. from last year's Wolfpack, as we speak, has not announced his decision yet. Will Wade and LSU have thrown a lot of money at Paul McNeil Jr. for him to follow Wade to the Tigers. Justin Gainey has made competitive offers for Paul McNeil Jr. to stay with the Wolfpack. That's a heck of a puzzle piece if he stays. If he doesn't stay, I think NC State has a good roster that we just described, but it would be, you know, pardon the pun, a middle-of-the-pack roster right now. 1 through 18 in the ACC. Justin Gainey's outline is not in the bottom third, but it's also not in the top third. By definition, that means it's in the middle third. If you add a few more pieces and things go well, you're an NCAA tournament team. If you don't add a few more starting caliber pieces and things go poorly, you end up on the bubble, even in this expanded NCAA tournament era. So whereas, we'll talk about Duke in a bit, but whereas the Devils are projected near the top of the national scene, the Tar Heels, good, top 25-ish, but not yet elite. And we'll get to Wake later, but NC State's kind of in the middle right now. Intriguing pieces, but absolutely not a sure thing as we head into year one with Justin Gainey.
Well, let's talk about Duke. Cameron Boozer, he is gone. Top 5 lock in the NBA draft, Isaiah Evans, gone too. And yet, ESPN's way too early top 25 has the Duke Blue Devils at number 2 in the country. That's a heck of a reload.
It is, man. Well, think about it. Even though you just outlined, I mean, the Blue Devils only lost, I think, 6 players. But Cameron Boozer, the National Player of the Year, was one of them. Isaiah Evans, all ACC, was another. And oh, by the way, Malik Brown was a senior. He's moving on to the next level, and he was a huge part of the Blue Devils' success this past season. So not a large number of departures at Duke. Some ACC teams lost 13 or 14 players. Duke, again, lost a much smaller number. But looking ahead to next year's team, here are the building blocks. Caleb Foster is a returning starter heading into his senior year. Dame Ssar is an NBA prospect and a returning starter. Pat Gongba is an NBA prospect and a returning starter, in his case, in the post. Caden Boozer wasn't a full-time starter last year, but by the end of the season, he was the Blue Devils starter at point guard. So if you want to put an asterisk, that would be 4 starting caliber returnees for the Blue Devils. John Shire hasn't had that in his relatively brief time at Duke. There's been much more roster churn, in part because the Blue Devils create so many early NBA entries after signing so many prep All-Americans and elite transfers. But 3.5, let's say, returning starters is a great foundation for John Shire. And then if we listed the 5 most impactful transfers on the inbound train to the Atlantic Coast Conference, John Blackwell of Wisconsin, a shooting guard, would be one of them. He was all Big Ten last year at Wisconsin. He averaged about 19 points per game. He shoots almost 40% from three-point land. He's a good defender. He has more assists than turnovers from the wing, which not all wing guards can say. He played like 34, 35 minutes a game last year for the Wisconsin Badgers. And again, that's with and against Big Ten caliber competition, which is always a much better predictor of how a guy will translate to the ACC. They also got kind of a role player type. He's not stylistically like Malik Brown, where the Blue Devils rated, remember, Syracuse's roster to get a guy who turned out to be the ACC's Defensive Player of the Year this past year. It's not a stylistic comparison, but the Blue Devils signed a Belmont big man named Drew Charnowski. He was all Missouri Valley for Belmont, and he's going to have a complimentary role for the Blue Devils because John Shire has yet again, even in this transfer portal world, he has signed another elite high school class. And whereas the general rule of thumb has become you can't rely too much on most freshmen because college basketball is older than it used to be. There are more international players coming in. There are more 22 and 23 and 24-year-olds playing. The extra year of COVID eligibility for a while made the game just an older game. And of course, there were exceptions, right? Cooper Flagg and Cameron Boozer dominated all the way to National Player of the Year status in their freshman year at Duke. We don't believe Duke has somebody that fits that description this year, so let's not be unfair with our expectations. But 7-foot forward Cameron Williams is the consensus number 2 player in the high school senior class. He will have a huge role, most likely next to Pat Gongba at forward, and a point guard that's easy to watch and fun to watch and easy to fall in love with. Darren Rippey Jr. was one of the top 10 high school seniors this past season, playing for Blair Academy, a really good program up in New Jersey. So, and there are others. I mean, it's an elite freshman class. When you take the big picture view, you have both Caden Boozer and Darren Rippey at point guard. You have John Blackwell and Dame Ssar and Caleb Foster on the wing. You have superstar at some point. He'll need more time to grow probably than Cooper Flagg or Cameron Boozer did. But Cameron Williams is a 7-foot, 210-pound guy with crazy impressive skills. He'll be at forward. Pat Gongba is back. Charnowski is in the mix. And there are others. But that's why you see Duke in the preseason top 5, because that's 3.5 returning starters from a Final Four team to go with that elite recruiting class from the high school ranks and a couple of contributing transfers. John Shire just is not missing a beat. They'll be the ACC favorite again, and they'll be among the top 5 to 10 teams nationally going into next year.
Let's go through Shire's first 4 years as the head coach of Duke, because he already has 3 ACC tournament titles, 2 ACC regular season titles, and yes, they hang that banner over in Cameron Indoor Stadium. 3 straight Elite 8 trips and that Final Four appearance in 2025. Do you see this mix of great incoming players along with a strong returning nucleus as the biggest difference in Shire's assignment in his year 5 at Duke?
That is one of the biggest differences, but I'll tell you the biggest one. It is something I briefly referred to earlier. Remember when we talked to John Shire 2 years ago at Operation Basketball, the media event, or maybe one of his visits on the David Glenn Show? He said, Cooper Flagg is our best player. His teammates know that. We're building the offense around that understanding that Cooper Flagg, even as an unorthodox 6'9" point forward type guy, even though he's making this leap as a relatively young freshman by today's standards, all the way to Duke and all the way into, high NBA draft pick status. Yeah, we're building around the freshman. He's going to be that good from day one, and we're going to build our image around him. Well, that's what John Shire did 2 years ago, creating that Final Four team. Last year, he did something similar, different player in Cameron Boozer, but another freshman who becomes the National Player of the Year, another guy who often filled that point forward unorthodox role that requires you to build your offense differently, right? When you have Jay Williams at point guard, you build your offense one way. When you have J.J. Redick at wing guard, one of the great shooters in college basketball history, you build your offense a little differently. When you have these unique 6'9" point forward guys, you build your offense a different way. Well, John Shire, unlike 2 years ago and unlike last year, that freshman, Cameron Williams, is sensational. That point guard, Darren Rippey Jr., is sensational. Bryson Howard's another good freshman on the way in for the Blue Devils. But I don't think Cameron Williams is viewed, even though he was the number 2 high school player in America last year, he's just not viewed through the same lens that ready from day one Cooper Flagg was and ready from day one Cameron Boozer was. That means John Shire's biggest challenge is to figure out what offensive approach, what offensive style, what mix of roles is going to be best for the Blue Devils. I mean, is Rippey by the end of next year the best point guard? Because we've seen Caden Boozer play well on the wing. We've seen Caleb Foster play well on the wing. Who's the Blue Devils' best player? Mike, that was never a question 2 years ago. Never a question last year. Cameron Boozer and Cooper Flagg were that good. I'm not 100% sure what the answer to that question will be next year. And that's kind of a good problem to have in one sense. Is the best player going to be John Blackwell? Is the best player going to be Pat Gongba? Is the best player going to be Darren Rippey by the end of the year? Is the best player going to be Cameron Williams by the end of the year, the 7-foot freshman? It's just harder to know that this time. And that's what most coaches deal with, right? The Cooper Flagg, Cameron Boozer back-to-back seasons were unusual. Very few freshmen today arrive with the ability to challenge for National Player of the Year honors. Duke signed them in back-to-back years, and they actually delivered that trophy, along with lots of other championships and on-court success. So that's John Shire's biggest challenge, going back to the whiteboard and figuring out in a less obvious way, the smartest way to fit these talented pieces of the puzzle together for the Blue Devils.
That's a heck of a challenge for John Shire, no doubt. And we've talked about Justin Gainey's challenge and Michael Malone's challenge. Now let's go to Winston-Salem and talk about Steve Forbes. He is back for year 7. He has still not made an NCAA tournament. Later on in the show, we're going to talk about the expansion from 68 to 76, and maybe that is the magic panacea for Wake Forest to make the NCAA tournament. But right now, let's look at the current status of the Demon Deacons. Juke Harris, your guy, is in the portal, and he's being courted by a lot of people throwing a lot of money his way. Miles Colvin, he's off to Clifton to play at Cincinnati and their new program. Cooper Schwager is off to Florida State. When you're losing players as an ACC school to another ACC school and to a school from the Big 12, that's tough sledding. But Forbes has done some great work in the portal. Let's give him some credit. In previous years with the Deacs, he's had Alondas Williams, Tyree Appleby, our guy Hunter Salas, all developing into first team all ACC players during their time in Deaconland. Now, has Forbes shown similar portal magic here in the spring of 26?
The short answer, unfortunately, is no. And I'm glad you mentioned those guys, because Steve Forbes earned the title of Portal Wizard with those examples. Remember, Alondas Williams was not a great player in the Big 12. Shows up at Wake, first team All-ACC, Player of the Year guy. Tyree Appleby was good at Florida, became great at Wake Forest. Hunter Salas struggled to get major minutes at Gonzaga, became one of the best players in the ACC. So Steve Forbes earned that title. He just hasn't earned an NCAA tournament bid yet, as you mentioned, and he has not yet, as we're having this conversation, he has not yet had the same portal magic this year. Unless, I'll put it this way, and I don't like to say it. Remember, a year ago, I warned Pitt fans, Boston College fans, and Wake fans. You just do not have an ACC caliber roster. There is no coach that can take a bottom tier roster and turn it into an NCAA tournament contender. We don't get those predictions right all the time, but we were right in all three of those cases last year. And I'm sad to say I think we're going to be right again about Wake Forest as we look forward to next season. Unless Steve Forbes has something up his sleeve for later this spring or even this summer. In today's world, you do sometimes see schools add a guy in July or August, usually from the international ranks. That's just the new world we're living in. Unless Steve Forbes has those aces in the hole, so to speak, this looks to me to be a clear-cut bottom third of the ACC roster. The Demon Deacons lost all 5 starters from last season. Some were seniors, of course, but Juke Harris is going to either stay in the NBA draft or most likely sign with Michigan or Tennessee. It's never a good sign when you cultivate a great player, as Wake has done Juke Harris, a Salisbury, North Carolina guy, over the past 2 seasons. It's never a good sign. You look like a feeder system for bigger schools when you develop good players, but then somebody comes in and plucks them out. SMU plucked Boopy Miller away from Wake a couple years ago, and he was an all-ACC point guard for the Mustangs instead of doing great things for the Demon Deacons. We'll see where Juke Harris ends up, but it's never a good sign when that happens. Even as you mentioned, kind of a backup forward, Cooper Schwager, is going to be playing for the Florida State Seminoles next year instead of perhaps being a starting forward for the Demon Deacons. We'll see how that shakes out. There's an intriguing signee at Wake named Kever Kennedy. He was the player of the year in the Metro Atlantic Conference last year at Merrimack. He averaged 18 points per game, great assist guy, 33% from three-point land. 18 points per game is a lot at any level. I will remind folks the Metro Atlantic is sort of, in the bottom 10 of the 31 college conferences. So you have to keep his enormous numbers. Kever Kennedy, he's a Philly guy, by the way. A lot of the guys I grew up with watched him in high school and say he's fantastic. He's very good on the defensive end of the court as well. But it's just fair to say it's a big jump from the Metro Atlantic to the Atlantic Coast Conference, and numbers don't usually translate as well. There are exceptions. There's a Clemson guard named Marquise Reed from years ago who was a multi-time All-ACC guy after coming from one of the lower-rated conferences. It does happen. It's just the exception. But as we speak, Isaac Carr, a nice guard on the wing, is the only Wake Forest returnee, and he was a backup last year, only a couple points per game. They have added a bunch of other transfers. You can find the full list at ncsportsnetwork.com. But they also have from the high school ranks, and they're intriguing, 6'10" or so twin brothers, Gavin and Gallagher Placide. It's hard to know how good they'll be, when they'll be really good, how quickly they'll get there. as newcomers to the ACC, but they were really good big men at Faith Family Academy in Dallas, Texas. Maybe they'll be first-year impact players for the Demon Deacons. But I just don't see a lot of talent on that roster, man. I mean, they signed Antonio Dorn, who was a backup center at Virginia Tech. He's 7 feet tall. He's 230 pounds. He'll give you some minutes in the post. But how big of an upgrade is that? They signed Jamari McDowell of the Kansas Jayhawks, but he only played about less than 20 minutes per game, 3 points per game. They signed a good player from Monmouth named Justin Ray, double-digit scorer on the wing, but again, big leap from Monmouth to the Atlantic Coast Conference. So I just don't see it, Mike. If we ranked the ACC men's basketball rosters from 1 through 18 in terms of what we see right now, we're still, 4 months away from the academic year starting at these universities. There will be tweaks to these rosters, but 1 through 18 right now, Wake is 16th, 17th, or 18th. And I have no joy in saying that. You know me, I just call it as I see it, even when it hurts to hear the truth. But that's where Steve Forbes is right now. And it's not a great place to be because, as you said, he's 0 for 6 in NCAA tournament trips. And I just don't see how this roster gives him a better chance of getting there, even with next year's expanded NCAA tournament.
That's a great point, David. The death nail for me was Steve Forbes, if it hadn't already been over the previous few seasons of not accomplishing the goal of making the NCAA tournament, was on the recruiting trail this year, because when UNC Greensboro made their change and hired Jared Haas, the two-time North Carolina Gatorade High School Player of the Year, Deontay Neal out of Reedsville, decommitted from UNC Greensboro and went on a big-time visit, highly publicized visit, over to Wake Forest after Forbes and Juke Harris came to see him play. That was a big-time laying your cards out on the table. And Deontay Neal has recommitted to UNC Greensboro that had a $95,000 NIL budget last year. So Deontay's not making his decision as an undersized guard, important to mention that, but he's not making his decision based on money or the glory of playing in the ACC. He's going to where he feels like he can be best developed. That is not a good sign for a guy that has been in the ACC on Tobacco Road. Steve Forbes now going into his 7th season. When you can't recruit an undersized, diminutive, almost dwarf-like Deontay Neal to come in and be your point guard, that's saying something right there. And I give Wake Forest all the props in the world for showing patience with Forbes. But you mentioned it earlier. North Carolina and NC State are infinitely behind where Duke is right now, because Duke not only is bringing in the big-time superstar talent, but now they're starting to retain people and get some depth. I think that's going to be problems for the rest of college basketball, guys with depth of that Duke experience under their belts. Wake Forest just seems like, I hate to say it, but it feels like they just aren't really focusing on basketball right now. And for Wake Forest to put more emphasis on football than basketball stuns me. And it's something that I really can't wait to corner John Curry on somewhere over the summer and say, hey, what's going on over there?
Smaller private universities, it varies from school to school, but as a general rule of thumb, smaller private universities are having a hard time keeping up in the name, image, likeness era. Duke, of course, is an exception to that rule. They have an enormous budget for their men's basketball roster and an incredibly built-out infrastructure around John Shire, as you and I have discussed on various platforms. But Notre Dame is wrestling with these money issues in men's basketball. Micah Shrewsbury has lost some starting players year after year after year to other Power 5 schools, just the way Steve Forbes has his examples of that phenomenon. Stanford is having a hard time building an elite roster, even under a good coach, Kyle Smith. Good teams, but not great teams, in part because so many of their guys have looked for greener pastures elsewhere. Boston College has had massive problems along these lines as a smaller college, right, with not as much money to spend. And Syracuse may be in the process of changing it, But one of the complaints Adrian Autry had during his time with the Orange was that they weren't competitive enough with these budgetary matters and name, image, likeness money and revenue sharing money. Those are all private universities, and they're all, with the exception of Duke, obviously, struggling in various ways to keep up with the masses, so to speak. And that'll be something to watch moving forward because it applies to our state of North Carolina schools, public and private, many of them, just as it applies to the public-private differential in the Atlantic Coast Conference.
Well, as you mentioned, there are 14 other teams in the Atlantic Coast Conference, and among those 14, which coaches have already assembled rosters that make them look like NCAA tournament caliber teams in your eyes, along with the Duke and Carolina teams that we've discussed already. The ACC had 8 teams make the NCAA tournament this past year, and all 5 of the teams you like most right now also made the big dance last year. Among the 10 programs that did not make the NCAA tournament from the ACC this past March, which ones have built rotations that you think might enable them to break through in the class of 76 here in 2027?
Yeah, you're right. At the top, I do have, in whatever order, Duke and UVA and Louisville and Miami and UNC. And I'm excited to answer this question about those who did not make the big dance a year ago, because I think these will be 2 of the more fun stories to watch over these next 12 months in ACC country. My short answer is Pitt and Syracuse. And Mike, you're going to laugh. I know you follow our stuff at ncsportsnetwork.com, but your brain works differently than mine, so you may not recall all of these details regarding the team that Jeff Capel has built at Pitt. This part cracks me up. So he has signed 10 newcomers, as we're having this conversation. Nate George is probably going to be his starting point guard. Where is Nate George from? The ACC. He's formerly the starter at Georgia Tech and Syracuse. Jaleel Bethea will be a player on the wing for Jeff Capel at Pitt this year. He most recently transferred in from Alabama. Where did he play for before that? The Miami Hurricanes of the ACC. Jonathan Powell will get minutes for Jeff Capel on the wing. Where did he play most recently? The North Carolina Tar Heels of the ACC. Star big man for Jeff Capel this coming season will be Bai Ndongo. Where did he come from? Georgia Tech, in his case, directly from the Yellow Jackets. So he's actually reuniting with his former point guard in Atlanta, Nate George, who again took a detour to Syracuse last year before landing at Pitt. Dongo is now with the Pitt Panthers. And at center, there is a Mercer transfer named Armani Mighty. He was all Southern Conference for the Mercer Bears last year. Averaged 13 points per game, 11 rebounds per game, a bunch of block shots. You know where Armani Mighty played before Mercer? How about Boston College of the Atlantic Coast Conference? So seriously, Jeff Capel could have a 5-man unit. I don't think they'll all be starters. But in a given lineup, he could have Nate George of Syracuse, Jaleel Bethea of Miami, Jonathan Powell of the Tar Heels, Bai Ndongo of Georgia Tech, and Armani Mighty of Boston College. I mean, and I say that in part because it's just a fun storyline, in part because coaches typically evaluate players they've seen more often, more accurately than those they may only see occasionally on film or video or whatever. So they certainly know who those 5 guys are. They all have plenty of experience at the college level, and they've all played in the Atlantic Coast Conference, or in Bethea's case, also the Southeastern Conference. But Jeff Capel also has 2 high school signees who could help right away. We've all heard of IMG Academy in Florida. A guy named Chase Foster could be an immediate impact guy at forward for the Pitt Panthers, and a guy named Jamal Jones probably will be an immediate impact guy as well at guard for the Panthers. Now remember, this is a complete rebuild for Jeff Capel, and he's on the hot seat as well. Now most of them were seniors. It was disappointing to see one of his starters at forward, Roman Cialepa. He left after his very good freshman year to sign with Ole Miss of the SEC. That's never a good sign. Remember, Pitt lost their star point guard, Jalen Lowe, for money reasons to Kentucky of the SEC a year ago. But I circle Pitt as one of these intriguing stories to follow. I believe, remember, this is 8 years at Pitt now. Jeff Capel has finished in the top 4 of the ACC standings twice, but he's made the NCAA tournament only once in 8 years. That was 2023. He had a really good forward named Blake Hinson, a really good guard named Jamarius Burton, and a tough point guard named Nellie Cummings. That's his one and only. He's made the NCAA tournament at other schools, VCU and Oklahoma, but Jeff Capel's only 1 for 8 in big dance trips with the Pitt Panthers, which obviously puts you on the hot seat. Some were surprised that he kept his job for another year. But after losing all 5 starters from last season, after losing 12 scholarship players overall, this is an incredibly intriguing rebuild with that very heavy ACC flavor, but he also got an all-Big South player from Charleston Southern named Alon Sumler. He averaged almost 20 points per game last year, shoots 40% from three-point land. Again, we'll see how he does with the adjustment to a higher caliber of talent in the Atlantic Coast Conference. But to me, in what'll be year 9 for Jeff Capel at Pitt, this is alongside that 2023 team as his best chance of making the NCAA tournament. Dongo at his best is a really good big man. Nate George at his best is a very reliable point guard. It's going to be a matter of getting something out of those freshmen and getting better versions of Jalil Bethea and Jonathan Powell on the wing. But it's a good high school recruiting class. It's a good portal class. I think Jeff Capel has a great chance to be one of the surprise teams in the ACC with his Pitt Panthers this coming season.
Now, before
and my other answer, my other answer is the Syracuse Orange. This is a fun story because, of course, unlike in stark contrast to the Pitt story, year 9 of Jeff Capel, this is year 1 for under head coach Jerry McNamara, who has left Siena. Remember, he took the Saints to the NCAA tournament, scared the bejesus out of the Duke Blue Devils in that early matchup. Now GMAC takes over at his alma mater, where he helped the Orange win the national title in 2003 as a player. He also later served under Jim Boeheim as an assistant coach, even worked under his predecessor, Adrian Autry, briefly as an assistant coach before getting that head coaching experience at Siena. This is also Syracuse, almost a complete rebuild. There are 11 guys gone, including all 5 of last year's most frequent starters. That includes Nate George, the point guard, heading to Pitt. It also includes Donnie Freeman, the star forward, heading to play for Rick Pitino at St. John's. So that part's not good news. But 2 contributors did stay at Syracuse. Kyan Anthony is the son of Carmelo Anthony, GMAC's, of course, star teammate on the 2003 NCAA title team, and a talented young forward named Sadiq White Jr. Those guys are both rising sophomores with plenty of talent. They decided to stay through the coaching change, and those are important building blocks. Jerry McNamara, and you love this storyline, Mike, as a longtime AD who has circled the amazing story of Curt Cignetti with Indiana football, bringing so many of his James Madison football players so that the Hoosiers could hit the ground running as they did under Curt Cignetti, despite a complete lack of football history prior to Cignetti's arrival. Syracuse, of course, has a nice basketball history, but the common thread here is that Jerry McNamara brought what I believe are his 3 best players from Siena. Now, again, that's the Metro Atlantic. That's a lower profile league. So we're all making educated guesses about how these numbers and how these talents transfer to the ACC. But Siena guard Gavin Doty was a first-team all-conference player for the Siena Saints. I'm convinced he's going to be really good for Jerry McNamara at Syracuse. A forward named Francis Folafak was probably their second best player at Siena. He's a member of the Syracuse team. And a guy who had some injury issues last year, but is a good post player, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Tasman Goodrick, maybe the Saints' 3rd best player when healthy, or one of the top 3. He is also a member of the Syracuse team. So 2 young but talented returnees, the 3 best players from the Siena Saints. He also went out as a former guard, remember, Jerry McNamara. He found a senior point guard named Garway Dual. Now, this guy was at McNeese State last year, and he had a pretty good season. Prior to that, though, he played for Providence in the Big East, also Seton Hall in the Big East. This guy is not a star, but Garway Dual is kind of a stabilizing senior presence at point guard. You know how much I value that position, and Jerry McNamara does as well. I think he's a stabilizer for the talent that I just described that will be around him. Jerry McNamara did. The Sun Belt's Defensive Player of the Year, a guy we know very well in this neighborhood. Luke Wilson is a 6'9", 255-pound behemoth who starred for the App State Mountaineers and was that Sun Belt Defensive Player of the Year last year. He is going to be patrolling the paint on defense for the Orange in year one under Jerry McNamara. The Orange also got a Temple guard named Aiden Tobiasen as another double-digit wing scorer. And he comes from a pretty good league, the American Conference. So that's much like I just described at Pitt. Whereas if you look at the bottom third of the ACC, they just have no chance. No level of coaching, no level of chemistry, no level of overachieving is going to turn them into NCAA tournament teams. Pitt and Syracuse have really intriguing assemblies of talent that if everything goes well, they could finish in the top 5 of the ACC. But even if there's some lumps along the way and a little bit of a roller coaster ride, I believe that even in year one under Jerry McNamara, and definitely in year 9 under Jeff Capel at Pitt, I think both can put themselves in the NCAA tournament conversation this coming year. And that would obviously be an improvement at either of those two schools, given what we've had in recent years.
Okay, let's go through a little rapid fire here. Our way too early ACC top 5, ACC Player of the Year, ACC Freshman of the Year, and the hottest seat of the coaches who still have jobs who have been here more than 2 years.
Yeah, way too early top 5. Let's go Duke, Louisville, Virginia, UNC, and Miami. Again, I encourage folks to check out our website. Louisville signed the Kansas big man, first team all Big 12. How hard is it to get that kind of guy in today's portal? It shows you the money the Cardinals are throwing around. Flory Badunga, he was the Defensive Player of the Year in that league, and he's proven himself, of course, at an elite level with the Jayhawks. And the Cardinals have other really accomplished newcomers, one from the G League and others from the transfer portal. But Duke, Louisville, Virginia, Miami, and UNC would be my way too early top 5. My ACC Player of the Year, unlike 2 years ago with Cooper Flagg, unlike last year with Cameron Boozer, those guys, of course, were not only ACC Player of the Year, they were the National Player of the Year. I think it's going to be harder to predict this time. And quick reminder, of the 15 players on last year's All-ACC team, only one will be back with the same team this season, and it's UVA's forward Tess DeRitter. Most of the All-ACC honorable mention guys are also gone. So if you're looking for candidates for 2027 ACC Player of the Year, don't look at last year's All-ACC team as your starting point. There's only one guy worth mentioning, really. That leaves the door wide open for either the guy I just mentioned, Flory Badunga from Kansas, superstar big man, now with the Louisville Cardinals. John Blackwell, now with Duke. He was all Big Ten at Wisconsin last year. He's going to be a big scorer on the wing. Given what we mentioned about John Shire building his offense, we're not sure Blackwell. Duke may have more balanced scoring than it has the last couple of years. And obviously you need to be, in most years, a pretty big scorer to be an ACC Player of the Year. Tess DeRitter, as a guy who was first team All-ACC, you have to throw his name on this list. He'll turn 24 years old during his sophomore season with the Virginia Cavaliers. My guess is just it's going to be more competitive than what we had once we realized how good Cooper Flagg was. That was quick early in the season. And once we realized how good Cameron Boozer was at Duke last year. The Freshman of the Year is also, in my opinion, harder to predict this time. As usual, the Duke Blue Devils will be in the mix there. Some combination of the 7-foot forward Cameron Williams, the point guard Darian Rippey Jr., the wing guard Bryson Howard. The Miami Hurricanes have a power forward named Caleb Gaskins. Another really good sign of a healthy program is when you're signing at least one prep All-American every year. Jay Lucas has only been at Miami for for 2 years, and he's done it 2 years in a row. Last year it was Shelton Henderson. This year it's Caleb Gaskins. And by the way, Henderson is back at Miami for his sophomore season. That's one of the reasons I have the Hurricanes in this top tier. Carolina has that wing player we mentioned earlier in the show named Maximo Adams. He was a McDonald's All-American, 6'7", good scorer, good rebounder on the wing, versatile defender. So much depends, whether it's player of the year or newcomer or freshman of the year, so much depends on the role that you earn in your first year on campus. Because you're not going to win one of those awards if you're just a complimentary piece. You have to be the true star. We'll see how that shakes out. And the hot seat coaches really quickly, rapid fire. Jeff Capel at Pitt, I think he can get back where he needs to be, but he's on the hot seat by definition in year 9. Steve Forbes at Wake in year 7. Micah Shrewsbury at Notre Dame in year 4 now, he's heading into with no NCAA trips. And then the veteran at Virginia Tech, Mike Young. I mean, he did take the Hokies to the ACC title just a few years ago, but it's been more bad than good lately from the Hokies. So you know how these things are unpredictable this far in advance. But Jeff Capel, Steve Forbes, Micah Shrewsbury, and Mike Young all really need to have good years in 2027-26 to take their names out of that hot seat competition.
Absolutely is the case, especially in Blacksburg, where Young will be dealing with a new athletics director after Whit Babcock's unexpected retirement here in the month of April. Now, let's pull back the camera to where this network lives, the bold North State. And beyond the 4 ACC schools, North Carolina has 15, count them, 15 Division I basketball programs. That is more college basketball, DG, than just about any state in the union. And when you put together the definitive recruiting report on all of these schools throughout the month of April at our website, ncsportsnetwork.com, and there are some really big headlines to discuss. Great work over there on the website. Which one or two recruiting stories are jumping out to you and saying, hey, talk more about me on today's show?
Yeah, short answer, and I do encourage folks to go to the website because that offers far more detail than you and I possibly could with our words today. Don't let me forget to circle back on the Seahawks, but my short answer is both the High Point Panthers, champions of the Big South, and the UNC Wilmington Seahawks, regular season champions of the Coastal Athletic Association. We've talked about it for 2 years now. What High Point has done as a private university in the Big South is off the charts fantastic. I mean, they went a quarter century after joining the Division I ranks without a single NCAA tournament appearance. And now they've done it 2 years in a row, first under Coach Alan Huss, who left for Creighton, his alma mater, and now, of course, under Flynn Clayman, our recent guest on the David Glenn Show. So Coach Clayman is back. You mentioned at the top of today's show, High Point not only made the big dance this year, they won a game in the big dance. That was a first in program history. But what's going on here, Mike, at both High Point and UNCW is you have intriguing returning players, and it's not easy if you're a mid-major power like High Point or Wilmington. If you have a really good player, like UNC Wilmington center Patrick Wessler was first team All-CAA. Well, now that's a great story, right? And he helped you win a regular season title. The downside is he might be poached by a Power 5 team. I mean, Patrick Wessler actually came from Virginia Tech before blossoming into a superstar with the Seahawks. He and 5 others have already announced they're staying with the Seahawks. So that gives Takeo Siddle in Wilmington a foundation of 6 returning players, on top of which he's added a bunch of guys that I'll get to in a minute. The story at High Point is a little bit different because so many of their best players were seniors. Obviously, you don't have the option to return. They have exhausted their eligibility. That new 5 years to play 5 seasons rule does not apply retroactively unless there's a last-second change. But High Point, they have Conrad Martinez back as their point guard, so that's a great keep. He was an incredibly efficient guy, usually off the bench this year, but that's your de facto returning point guard. They picked up South Florida guard C.J. Brown, who also can play the point. He averaged double digits. Mike, if you're in the Big South Conference and you're luring a double-digit scorer from the American Conference, which is, a top 10 league, that is an unusual storyline. It's usually the reverse, right? It's the top 10 conference team plucking somebody from a Big South Conference squad. High Point has turned that upside down. So they not only have a returning point guard, they have C.J. Brown, kind of a combo guard from South Florida. Pretty good driver, defender, double-digit scorer, 5 assists per game. That's a sign of a good point guard. They also signed a top 200 guy out of the high school ranks. That is not easy to do in the Big South Conference. His name is Trey Pearson, another point guard. He played at John Paul II in Hendersonville, Tennessee. Again, these are not things that happen in the Big South Conference very often. Keeping one of your better players, signing a double-digit scorer from the American Conference, signing a top 200 high school recruit. So kudos to Flynn Clayman and his staff. Those are the reasons. Like when you're doing things your competitors are not doing, both financially at High Point, but also in terms of finding fits for your unique philosophy offensively, the way Coach Huss and Coach Clayman have talked about their offensive efficiency requirements and parameters that they look for in addition to, of course, unselfishness and other just human characteristics and teamwork characteristics. Check out our interviews with those guys if you want to learn more about that philosophy. But here's another example at High Point. A guy named Jason Rivera Torres, 6'7" wing player, was all CAA at Monmouth last year. He averaged 16 points and 8 rebounds per game. Now, I don't expect fans to have an off the top of their head understanding of what's, number one conference versus the 31st conference in America. But let's just say, generally speaking, the CAA is a higher ranked conference than the Big South, where High Point plays. Nevertheless, High Point from the Big South goes up the ladder and plucks from Monmouth an all CAA player who averaged 16 points and 8 rebounds per game last year. That is not a common story. These are the reasons High Point is shattering perceptions of what it once was and becoming one of the most prominent mid-major programs in the entire country. Those are not the only examples, but the C.J. Brown South Florida example, the Jason Rivera Torres Monmouth example, the Trey Pearson high school example, they got a guy from from Mali, the country of Mali, Yusuf Traore. Apologies if I mispronounced that. He's a 6'10" post player who in Spain's under-22 league last year averaged 13 points and 7 rebounds per game, shot almost 60% from the field. Like, again, that's not something you see happening in the Big South Conference very often. They are building something special. They'll be the favorite probably in the Big South again, and it's a credit to that university's administration, their attitude and financial approach to basketball and its facilities and its budgets, and also really good coaches and players in Flynn Clayman and country. And then quickly on UNC Wilmington, again, I mentioned the 6 returning players. Mike, there are ACC teams that have 0 returning players. There are many ACC teams that have 1 or 2 returning players. I mentioned I'm optimistic about Pitt and Syracuse. Pitt has 1 scholarship player back. Syracuse has 2 scholarship players back. So the fact that Takeo Siddle, who won the CAA regular season title last year and, of course, has taken the Seahawks to the big dance prior to that, the fact that he has 6 guys back from that team, a couple of them were injured, so maybe they get, healthy, better versions of them as returning scholarship players now that they're healthy. But they took from South Florida of the American Conference Xavier Brown. He was a double-digit scorer 2 years ago. He redshirted this past season for injury reasons, but that was an interesting pickup. Northeastern has a wing scorer named William Kermorey, who shoots about 40% from three-point land and averaged 13 points per game at Northeastern. That is a similar level program at UNCW, so it's a super healthy sign for any mid-major franchise to keep so many quality returning players, but then to go and pluck from other mid-major rosters some of their best players. It's not easy to find a 13-point per game, 40% three-point shooter guy. They did at UNCW in the form of William Kermorey. And how about this for, we're not sure where it's going to go, but intriguing examples. 2 of them real quick. From the Miami Hurricanes, we didn't see him last year because he redshirted in the ACC. Trayvon Maddox is a 6'6", 180-pound wing player who's now a UNCW Seahawk. Maybe in 1 year under Jay Lucas, it became clear he wasn't quite ready yet for the ACC. Maybe he's more than ready for the CAA. We'll see. And then lastly on the Seahawks, just because this is an unorthodox story, there's a big man named Tyler Nelson. He's about 6'7", 225 pounds. He's a power forward. He previously played at Navy, and he was all-Patriot, an all-Patriot League selection for the midshipmen. 12 points per game, 6 rebounds per game, hits 36% of his threes he did in his final or most recent season with the Middies. What's intriguing about this, you know how when Navy guys are done, they got to serve our country, right? Well, Tyler Nelson, I don't know his exact age off the top of my head, but he's got to be, 25 years old or something close to that. After serving our country, he is returning to college basketball. He has not played, Mike, in the last 3 seasons. So you want to talk about creative recruiting. UNCW gets Trayvon Maddox, the red shirt from the ACC at Miami. They get William Kermori from a competitor, Northeastern, sharpshooter on the wing. They get Xavier Brown from South Florida after his redshirt year. Again, double-digit scorer at James Madison year before last. And they get Tyler Nelson coming off of his military service as a really intriguing power forward who certainly can bring plenty of, manliness and age and experience and leadership, given his background at the Naval Academy. One more, they went across the state and plucked out of Cullowhee, North Carolina, Western Carolina guard Talon Petway. He's a wing player, almost a 40% three-point shooter, almost 10 points per game for the Catamounts. I mean, to me, just like High Point will be the favorite in the Big South, UNCW at least will be one of the favorites in the CAA again this year. Takeo Siddle has finished in the top 3 of the CAA standings 5 years in a row. And 2025, of course, was the trip to the NCAA tournament. 2026 was the regular season title and an NIT trip. But Flynn Clayman and Takeo Siddle, man, they are hitting on all cylinders, and they have all of the material, talent-wise, that you could want going into next season as favorites in their respective leagues.
Well, as Siddle and Clayman already have their programs on the road to some big-time things, there are 3 other new coaches here in the Bold North State who are aiming to do just that for their new programs. We're talking about Wes Miller at Charlotte, Jared Haas at UNC Greensboro, and Jimmy Williams at Campbell. Which of those guys has given themselves the best chance of hitting the ground running during their first year on the court?
I think the Campbell job is a difficult one for Jimmy Williams for a lot of reasons, including those you wrote about eloquently at our website, ncsportsnetwork.com. We encourage folks to just seek that out because I think that was a brilliant, through the eyes of a longtime athletic director, breakdown of the challenges of winning in men's basketball at various mid-major schools, including Campbell. So good luck to Jimmy Williams in year 1. He has brought a couple of his players with him from Anderson, Division II program in South Carolina. So we'll see how that shakes out. I also want to give Jared Haas some quick kudos for signing the guy you mentioned earlier. Deontay Neal from Reedsville High School is a big-time football player and a big-time basketball player. And if he was just a few inches taller, he would have been recruited by everybody. So he gets to stay real close to home there at UNCG. So kudos to Jared Haas to getting that young man to recommit Deontay Neal to the Spartans after originally committing to the previous staff. But my answer to the question, which of the 3 new guys in our state has the best chance to hit the ground running? It is Wes Miller at Charlotte. And somewhat similar to the Syracuse theme with Jerry McNamara bringing his 3 best players from Siena to the Orange, at Charlotte in the American Conference, Wes Miller's first team is going to have at least 4 guys who followed Wes from Cincinnati of the Big 12. And one of them, for example, Jizzle James. He will be on our all-name team here in the Bold North State next year. Jizzle James is a 6'3" guard who averaged in double-digit scoring for the Bearcats against Big 12 competition. He's a 44% three-point shooter, about 11 points per game a year ago. So that's not just a guy following Wes Miller from the Bearcats to the 49ers. That's a clear-cut starting caliber player who will bolster Wes Miller's first team in the Queen City. I'm also impressed. I don't know the other guys that followed Wes Miller from Cincinnati quite as well as I have seen Jizzle James play, but I was impressed that the first 6 signees that I saw for Charlotte under Wes Miller in the American Conference, all 6 were from Power 5 leagues. So obviously the 4 Cincinnati guys have experience in the Big 12. It is not easy to get a double-digit scorer, proven performer from another Power 5 program. Remember, the American is a top 10 league, but it is not a top 5 league. Well, not only did Wes Miller get Jizzle James, double-digit scorer in the Big 12, to follow him to Charlotte, he got a forward named Dylan Grant from Rutgers of the Big 10. 10 points per game, 4 rebounds per game, decent three-point shooter. I mean, that's probably a starting guard in Jizzle James with Big 12 experience, a starting forward in Dylan Grant with Big 10 experience. You don't see that in the American Athletic Conference very often. He also went to Georgetown, and this guy didn't play as much in the Big East, but Jaden Fort is a 6'9" guy in the post who played a little bit for Georgetown last year, not a lot of minutes, but blocked some shots, efficient scorer, good rebounder, so he could be a role player in year 1 in the American Conference. So Wes Miller still has to build out his roster. It's harder to forecast the 49ers season because, again, some of these coaches know 14 of their 15 players already. I don't think Wes maybe only has a little bit more than half of his roster already in place, but I've been really impressed by his ability to sign guys with experience in the Power 5 leagues because, again, historically speaking, they have the best chance of their skills and their numbers translating to another top 10 league, the American Conference. And I imagine Wes Miller has a lot more ideas and players and talents in the pipeline between now and when the 49ers tip off this fall.
David, we're going to get to the expansion of the NCAA tournament in just a little bit, but one last question before we move on to our next segment, and that is the through line for me, sitting where I used to sit as the director of athletics, is this. The schools investing in operations are simply pulling away. We wrote about this on why Duke wins. It is a very simple calculus. If you plan, you will achieve. If you hope, you will be a dope. High Point's 9 commits. UNCW's impressive list of transfers that you just talked about. Charlotte raiding UC's roster and making people sad in Clifton. Those are operational decisions. Meanwhile, North Carolina A&T, their AD, Earl Hilton, has already joined the growing list of guys who are saying no mas, pulling the Roberto Duran, saying they don't want that responsibility anymore, and who can really blame them? But right now, North Carolina A&T has only one guy. The transfer era has separated programs that have NIL infrastructure from those that don't. This seems to be a real challenge for college basketball.
Yeah, Mike, Duke is among the biggest spenders in the ACC, and Duke is at the top of the ACC most of the time. And of course, you still have to coach well. You still have to develop players. You still have to build chemistry. It's not as easy as buying success, but it certainly helps as a starting point. High Point has the largest budget for basketball in the Big South. So again, you still have to connect the dots. You still need good coaches, good players, but spending much more than your opponents maximizes your chance of hitting the ground running or year after year after year success, the way we've seen at UNC Wilmington under Takeo Siddle and High Point in recent years under multiple coaches. At the other end of the spectrum, you wrote about Campbell's struggles in men's basketball and otherwise. You just made reference to North Carolina A&T's struggles, and that has been a growing trend as you try to jump into a more competitive league, but you don't have as many resources as many of those in your new conference that you're trying to beat and you're asking your coaches to compete against. It's still hard to predict, who who's going to finish first, second, third, and fourth in a certain league. Our crystal balls are not that accurate, but as a starting point, in any conference in America, we could list 4 or 5 schools that take the most aggressive financial approach, and probably 4 or 5 at the bottom that are trying to scrape by. And what happens every year? Not all, but most of the big spenders do well or very well. And not all, but most of the scraping by programs struggle. There are exceptions at both ends. Some of the big spenders face plant because even though they spent a lot of money, they didn't hire the right coach. They didn't recruit the right fits for their system. And of course, there will always be overachievers, winning more while spending less. But as a starting point, there's no doubt some of these schools are giving their coaches all of the tools they could possibly need compared to others in their conference to be competitive or even to win the league. And other schools are repeatedly asking their coaches to overachieve on shoestring budgets. It's not always easy to quantify these things numerically and financially, but as a general theme, some of the examples we've outlined today give you an idea of who's starting with a head start and who's trying to play catch up in major college basketball.
Hey, Wolfpack Nation. You already know that when we talk about the great traditions of NC State athletics, Amedio's Italian restaurant is right at the heart of it. Since 1963, it's been the go-to spot for generations of Pack fans. The walls tell the story, the food seals the deal, and every visit feels like part of the family. Whether it's pre-game pasta, post-game celebrations, or just a night out on Western Boulevard, Amedio's delivers every single time. Great people, great plates, and pure NC State pride. Stop by Amedio's, a true Wolfpack original.
Michael Berard, Managing Director Investments with the Founders Group at Stifel, works with a select group of high net worth individuals and institutions to develop and implement investment plans tailored to their specific objectives and risk tolerances. If you are interested in highly personalized, well-researched guidance and outstanding personal service, you can contact Michael at 984-364-2002. That's 984-364-2002. Stifel, Nicholas and Company Incorporated, member SIPC and NYSE.
All right, DG, we've saved the biggest stuff for last. 4 macro storylines that are going to define college basketball, not just for 26-27, but for the next decade. Number 1, 5 to play 5. The NCAA Division I Board of Directors recently advanced the rule, 5 years of eligibility, age-based, starting the regular academic year after a kid turns 19 or graduates high school. This is the problem with the NCAA. They write everything like it's some type of an SAT question. I mean, it just really isn't that difficult. But we digress. President Trump signed an executive order back in April directing the NCAA to create rules around 5 years of eligibility. Set the table for our audience, DG. What does this all actually mean?
Well, it's a big jolt to the way rosters are built, right? And again, this 5-for-5 rule is not going to apply retroactively. So if you have a favorite player, fourth-year senior Seth Trimble at UNC or somebody else from another school, according to the way the rule is written right now, those guys are not going to get a 5th year of college basketball. But rather than all these applications for medical red shirts, rather than all these applications and often lawsuits for an additional year of eligibility, the NCAA is seeking something that is more one size fits all. And I'm sure this, by the way, is going to be challenged with lawsuits. Somebody in the class that's not getting the 5th year is going to argue, hey, all the guys before us got 5 years because of the COVID bonus year. Now all the people after us are getting 5 years because you're actually instituting it as a rule. What about us? Why are we the only ones in this modern era that aren't getting 5 years to play 5 seasons? We'll see if that is a successful argument in the court of law or not. But the way it's going to happen moving forward is a little different in the transfer era with so many players coming and going regardless of class. But you have to just expect that in most cases, there are still going to be exceptions for, religious service missions and military service, and maybe a small number of other things. But generally speaking, once you turn 19 or once you graduate from high school, whichever of those two things happens first, you have a 5-year clock. And you have only those 5 years to use all 5 years of eligibility, or 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, but you only get 5 years starting either when you graduate from high school or when you turn 19 years old, again, whichever happens first. That adds a lot more predictability. It reduces the number of appeals and requests for exceptions. And coaches have to keep in mind, if you're watching a 4th-year star at another school under the current rules, he's not available as a transfer to your school for year 5. Now you just have to have a completely new paradigm. Everybody has the ability to stay in college for a 5-year period that is tied to his high school graduation or his 19th birthday. And you have to recruit with that in mind. You have to build rosters with that in mind. Doesn't mean there aren't going to be complications, right? You're still going to have guys deciding whether or not to turn pro early or stay in school longer. You're still going to have guys trying to decide whether to stay at their current school or to transfer out. We have to wait and see whether the NCAA adopts other rules that limit transfers. But it's a new paradigm. It does start this coming season, but it's a new way of doing things that all coaches, all general managers, and even young people themselves and their parents have to adjust to, because it's a big change. For decades, the rule has been you do have 5 years to play 4 seasons, meaning you're allowed 1 for a traditional red shirt or a medical red shirt or for any other reason. But Mike, we've had 7th, 8th, and 9th year college athletes because of various extensions for COVID, extensions for multiple medical issues where you missed multiple seasons for multiple reasons. I mean, we've truly had 8th and 9th year college players. This is designed to make it closer to one size fits all with fewer asterisks. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea. I think these schools and these coaches and even these young people wanted more certainty. The NCAA certainly wanted fewer lawsuits and fewer, splitting hairs examples where this person deserved a waiver, but this other person did not. They got tired of those decisions. They got tired of those lawsuits. 5 years to play 5 seasons sounds a lot closer to a simple approach. And it's the new reality that we're dealing with starting with the 2026-27 season.
So let's bring this close to home. Let's go to the kitchen table. And what does this mean for that kid from North Carolina who's now thinking, do I take a prep year? Do I do a JUCO year? Do I play in Europe for a season? The decision tree, it seems like it just got more complicated for the kids, and it got easier for the administrators who, as we alluded to earlier, are retiring in droves right now because they don't want to deal with the rules that they're making.
Yeah, I don't know if it's that much more complicated. One of the harder parts for high school folks is that so many transfers and so many people hanging around for more years has actually reduced the number of scholarship opportunities for high school seniors. Whether their aim is to play in a Power 5 league, more of those schools are signing transfers. More of those schools are signing international guys to scholarships that in the old days more often would have gone to high school seniors. So that's the bigger adjustment. And remember, that part is not going to change under this 5-for-5 framework that the NCAA is in the process of adopting. Because the NCAA has set it up such that your 5-year clock begins either when you turn 19 or when you graduate from high school, one of those two things is going to force the clock to start. Remember, in the past, you would have guys sometimes go to, sometimes parents would hold them back a year, and then you'd have a year of prep school after that, so that by the time you got to college, you might have been 20 years old already. This is going to prevent that, because even if you mess with your high school graduation date, once you turn 19, that 5-year clock begins. So I don't know if it's a dramatic change from what high school students have been dealing with, but it is certainly something new for them to consider. And I think most college athletes are glad that it is a possibility, right? They thought it was unfair that there were these rules, in football. Why can't we just use this guy toward the end of the season? Well, we don't want to burn his redshirt year. Now that doesn't matter at all, right? Coach can look at his bench in basketball, look at his sideline in football. There's no downside to playing anybody at any time because you're not burning a year of eligibility. There's no such thing as a red shirt anymore. You have 5 years to play 5 seasons. If you're not good enough to play, you're not going to play, but that's not a red shirt anymore. The way coaches often had to make mid-season or late season decisions. Oh, I don't want to be unfair to this young man by playing him for only a few games at the end of the season because I don't want to burn his redshirt year. Now, everybody gets 5 years. If you're good enough to play, you're going to play. If you're not good enough to play in the eyes of your coach, you're not going to play. But yeah, it's just one more layer to a complicated cake for these young people and their parents.
Well, you're nice to call that a piece of cake because the next thing we're going to talk about, I would call a giant shit sandwich. There, I said it. And let's go to our big thing number 2, the NCAA tournament expansion. This means that the men's and women's basketball tournament are headed to as soon as this coming year. 8 more games, a 24-team opening round in Dayton, and a second site, then back to a clean 64. David, you've covered this league, the NCAA, every iteration of March Madness from 64 to 65 to 68. What's your read on going to 76 in this 250th anniversary of 1776? It seems like now the freedom now expands to more mediocre teams in college basketball.
Here's the bottom line with NCAA tournament expansion. The overwhelming majority of college basketball fans did not want this to happen and do not think it's a good idea. Why is it going to happen anyway? Because fans don't make the decisions. And a majority of the people who make decisions in college athletics did want this to happen. Remember, most coaches wanted it to happen. Why? Because that gives more of them a chance to add something we've talked about a lot on today's show. So Coach so-and-so is 0 for 7 in NCAA tournament appearances, 1 in 8 years, and that puts you on the hot seat. Well, with more at-large bids, that gives more of those bubble teams bids to the NCAA tournament, so more of those coaches can have more of those lines on their resume when it comes to getting a new contract or explaining their resume at a certain school. We also know that the NCAA folks are going to get more money. I know they claim publicly it's not about the money. It's always about the money, at least in part. And when you have more inventory for an event, remember, the NCAA, this is a crazy stat, so I'll say it slowly. The NCAA and its annual revenue makes more than 90% of it either directly or indirectly from the NCAA men's basketball tournament. Imagine running a 365-day-a-year operation where a 3-week event, the NCAA tournament, directly, meaning your multimedia contracts with your TV and streaming partners. That's the billions of dollars that come into the NCAA. Remember, football does not fill the NCAA coffers at the FBS level. Men's basketball does. And if you add the direct TV and streaming money to what I call the indirect money related to the NCAA tournament, that could be sponsorships, royalties, etc., adjacent to the big dance, 90-some% of the entire annual NCAA budget is directly or indirectly tied to this single event. More inventory means more dollars at a time when many universities are stressed and many conferences are stressed because of increasing expenses, name, image, likeness, university to athlete revenue sharing, etc. So of course, money was a driving force in this equation. But enough commissioners, enough suits at the NCAA executive office, and certainly enough coaches were, it might not be a reverse of the public opinion, but I'd be willing to bet 80 to 90% of college basketball fans did not want this expansion. But certainly something close to a large majority of decision makers wanted it, or it wouldn't have happened. It's mainly about the money. And I'll add this quickly, Mike. I am not fundamentally philosophically against expanding the NCAA tournament, and I'm not going to lose any sleep over the move from 68 to 76. There are more important things in life to worry about. But I have had my eyes open. In this new world where the international talent pipeline is bigger than ever, where the transfer portal, obviously, and name, image, likeness money has caused players to jump around to an unprecedented degree, I've left my mind open to the idea that at some point the bubble could get stronger. In other words, if these changing forces of the college basketball universe led to a world where year after year, you're looking at bubble teams saying, man, I'll feel horrible to leave this team out. If we got to that point because of just the changing nature of college basketball and the parity factor, then I would be open to expanding the NCAA tournament. But in most recent years, I've looked at the tournament bubble and said, no, you don't deserve to be there. You're kind of lucky to be there. Again, I'm not losing sleep over the expansion. It's only an additional 8 teams, and I get it. They need the money. But we're not yet at the point where the competitive factor is the explanation for the need to expand the NCAA tournament. We can all roll our eyes when they say it's not about the money. Again, it is about the money, and it is about the coaches pushing for this and the administrators pushing for this, but it's going to be an even more diluted bubble. The Power 5 teams are going to grab the majority of those additional at-large selections. So financially, the Power 5 benefits. Financially, those reputationally, those coaches benefit, and financially, the NCAA benefits, and that's why we're going from 68 to 76.
Man, you talk about the administrators wanting it. They want it because it keeps the donors off their ass whenever their team makes the NCAA tournaments. That's one less phone call or one less trip they have to go take to get on their knees and beg for money. The coaches want it because they're the same guys whose agents in the Gazelle Group invented something called the CBI or the CIT or some other alphabet soup crap sandwich that they're trying to force down your throat in March. And to me, it just is more the mediocrity, the drive towards mediocrity that we've seen in college football, to where we have sub 500 teams now playing. You don't even have to be in the top half of college football to make this bowl season that good people put on. I love bowl games, got a case full of bowl rings back here from being a part of a lot of them. But brother, I'm telling you, that is a hard sell to go to a sponsor and say, hey, we want you to increase what you're paying Coca-Cola because we have the 10th place team from the ACC now playing in this tournament. That's it's fodder for bettors. That's what it is. There's sponsor money, but it's also feeding that gambling machine. And I don't know, there's so many places that we could go with this, but I'll give you the final word on it.
Yeah, back to the money factor, keep in mind that the reason there are so many bowl games is largely tied to the fact that all but a few games during bowl season get millions of viewers. At least 1 million, and oftentimes 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, all the way up into the 10 plus million for the biggest bowl games. But the little ones exist because enough people watch. It is an economic model if you have a TV inventory item that is virtually assured of getting 1 or 2 million or more TV and streaming viewers. It is the time of year, right? A lot of people are home for the holidays. There's plenty of days leading up to the college football playoff where it's carefully crafted. There's 1 bowl game this day and then 2 that day and a few more. And ESPN even owns some of the bowls. Otherwise, they wouldn't exist because the economic model might break down. But when ESPN knows it can get 1 million or 2 million or 3 million or 4 million for sometimes mediocre or less bowls, sometimes 6-6 versus 6-6 in terms of their regular season records, or as you said, occasionally even worse, as long as that economic model remains in place and ESPN's going to get that TV number of viewers and streaming viewers, that means the sponsors are willing to pay for it. And that means we're going to have a ridiculous system where more than half the teams, make a bowl game. Similarly, even if, let's say 90% of college basketball fans hate the idea of NCAA tournament expansion, enough of them are going to watch those early games that get us to the old school round of 64. Enough millions will watch that it will justify the expansion financially. And so, in the sense, you could blame the NCAA for being greedy, but at the same time, this is about consumer feedback. If truly nobody was watching that 6-6 football team play that 6-6 football team, if it was truly a tiny TV number, that bowl would disappear eventually. Similarly, if their projections were such that most people would tune out these early pre-64 games in the new version of the NCAA tournament, the economic model wouldn't work. So yes, it's a reflection of going after more money, but it is also a reflection of the American sports consumer's thirst for even mediocre bowl games in enough numbers and even bubble-licious NCAA tournament games in enough numbers. Even if a whole bunch of people who hate the concept of NCAA tournament expansion say, I'm not watching those early games, that's okay, because as long as a big enough chunk of even those who hated tournament expansion do watch, it makes for a viable economic model. And these presidents and these chancellors and these commissioners and the NCAA president feel the need to maximize their revenue streams at a time when college sports is more expensive than ever.
They will get their money, and they're also going to take a problem off of their plate too, because they don't have to deal with angry people bitching and moaning that they haven't made the tournament in, a decade. So it all works, and we move on to number 3 and our big topics here at the end of this show, and that's the international wave. And let's go back to last October when you and I were at the ACC basketball tip-off in Charlotte, and we talked to our favorite coach, Kyle Smith, about why it makes sense to recruit international kids over domestic kids. And I'll let you dive into that. We're going to have something coming up on this at ncsportsnetwork.com and our X account here in the next few days. But we've already talked about in this show players from Spain, Mali, I'm reading now, Slovakia, Australia, Italy, France, Germany, Finland. This is starting to sound like we're playing a game of basketball Risk. Rick Pitino has been saying this for a long time now. NIL Plus, the new eligibility framework, has fundamentally changed who plays college basketball here in the United States. I mean, it is a very different game as we head into the 26-27 season.
It is, Mike, and it's important to emphasize from the 60,000 feet view. Of course, we have had international basketball players since before I started covering college basketball, right? I mean, you and I are old enough to remember Hakeem Olajuwon with the Houston Cougars back in the early 1980s, right? He was an international player in college basketball, and that is almost 50 years ago, 50 or so years ago at this point, or almost that much. The reality is that until name, image, likeness, we're only 5 years into that, and revenue sharing, university money going directly to athletes, we're only 1 year into that. Previously, if a European player or his mom or dad or advisor thought he wanted to blend the university setting with his basketball future, he would usually come to the United States to finish high school so that American college coaches had a chance to recruit him at Oak Hill Academy or one of the New England prep schools, or there's a whole bunch of them that have sprung up over decades, right? And that was a sign, even before the money factor, that was a sign that some families thought that the American way, blending university level education with a ramp way to professional basketball, was the right way. But in Europe, it's not that way. In most of the world, it's not that way. In Europe, if you're 17 years old, sometimes even earlier, you choose kind of a basketball apprenticeship, the way a plumber would choose a plumbing apprenticeship, right? And rather than blending the American university system with the goal of getting to the NBA through the basketball, which is a pretty good caliber in NCAA hoops, overseas, it would be much more the 17-year-old working out with 35 and 32 and 28 and 25-year-old men who play for FC Barcelona or Real Madrid's top team, But the 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old would be in there working with those guys, most cases not good enough to play on the top team. But as we mentioned earlier in today's show, those same top teams always have under 22 teams or under 20 teams, etc. So the apprenticeship approach, you didn't have to go to class. You could if you wanted in Europe, but you could dedicate your life to basketball the way a plumber in an apprenticeship would not have the distractions of classes or whatever beyond plumbing. The American way is now offering money in ways it couldn't before. Previously, the only Euros that came here wanted to blend an American education with the platform of preparing for the NBA. Now you get the best of both worlds. Why is this faucet absolutely overflowing? It's because guys who used to, and some of them were already well on their way to the apprenticeship concept. Tess de Ridder of Belgium had played in a European program for 4 or 5 years before signing with UVA and becoming that 23-year-old college freshman with the Cavaliers. Some guys saw money opportunities that were not in play in the 1980s, 1990s, and even the first 20 years of this century. 5 years ago, pre-NIL, this was not a thing. Now you can have the benefit, if you want, of an American college education. You can have both name, image, likeness money and revenue sharing money. And it's sort of the best of both worlds financially, educationally, and of course, you are still putting yourself on a platform, as you would in Europe, that allows NBA scouts to see you as much as they possibly could. Not everybody is cut out for it. Not everybody wants to deal with the language barrier in some cases. Not everybody wants to take college classes. But a whole big chunk, just look around the ACC for examples. Almost every team had in its rotation last year a member of the international basketball community. And I know there were rare examples of that 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, and 10 years ago. Now, those examples are not rare at all. And it is because of the changing financial realities of college sports and the changing financial possibilities for those who grow up in Europe or other parts of the world and are now intrigued by NCAA basketball in numbers that are absolutely skyrocketing compared to what they were even 5 years ago.
Okay, we've saved the best for last. Our fourth big-time storyline is the Big 12. And Brett Yormark, he's the commissioner of the Big 12. He is a mover and a shaker. And he and his league, the Big 12, have approved now a 5-year private capital deal with Redbird Capital and Weatherford Capital. Yes, that Weatherford of Florida State Board of Trustees fame. Ross Dellinger, a good friend of both of ours, reported it for Yahoo Sports. 3 prongs, at least $12.5 million in capital infused into the league office for commercial development, an opt-in of $30 million credit line for each of the member schools, 16 of them. That's $48 million. Wow. Just south of, hold on.
It's 480.
Yeah, let me get this right. At least $12.5 million in capital infused into the league office for commercial development, an opt-in of $30 million of credit for each of the 16 member schools at a rate just south of 10%. That's $480 million, David, and a strategic business partnership that positions the conference for its next media rights negotiation. Redbird, by the way, has an ownership stake in Paramount, which now owns CBS and is in talks for TNT. The Big 12's current ESPN Fox Media deal expires in 2031. So this is the first publicized conference-wide private capital deal in the history of major college sports. If we think that we have seen change so far just with name, image, and likeness and a few eligibility rules, it's nothing like this. And that has to make a guy like Jim Phillips down in his cozy penthouse in Charlotte tighten up just a bit, because now the clock is on, because the Big Ten has their money. They are the king. The SEC is rolling in there in second. And now here comes the Big 12. And where's the ACC, David? What do you say?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of private capital, or in different contexts, it's actually private equity, where you're giving up part ownership of your enterprise for outside money. I know this, having been involved in the business world in some private equity situations, they always get their money and they are soulless in the degree they will go to pursue that money. It is hard to find people in that big money world who truly care about the ins and outs and ups and downs and philosophical values of your enterprise. Private capital and private equity is often soulless, greedy, Gordon Gekko style, Wall Street, unapologetic capitalism to the extreme. And I'm not sure that's a great marriage for college sports, which does, of course, want to make money, and there's nothing wrong with that, but also has a broader purpose on the American sports scene. That does include, even if people want to roll their eyes, educating a lot of people and teaching a lot of life lessons along the way. So it is not a surprise at all that, as you said, the league that is in fourth place, right? There's four Power Four leagues. The Big Ten has so much money, it doesn't even have to think about a deal that they have reservations about in any way, private capital, private equity, or otherwise. The SEC is pretty close to that, and you've seen some of those university presidents show real caution when private capital or private equity proposals are put before them. And again, I think that's because the Big Ten and the SEC are making all decisions from a vantage point of financial strength. They are the two wealthiest leagues in the history of college sports, and it's not even close. Well, guess what? The one league that just went for this private capital deal was in fourth place. The Big 12 has really good basketball most of the time, good but not great football most of the time. And football, this is an ACC problem as well. Football has become the tail that wags the dog in major college sports. So the Big 12 is not as compelling a TV product for purposes of those negotiations when they come up leading into that 2031 expiration of the Big 12's TV deals. The Big 12 football product has some great exceptions to the rule, but there's no way that either the ACC or the Big 12 is going to develop a football product that is drawing the TV numbers that the Big 10 and the SEC draws routinely for its college football product. So when you're more desperate financially, you're more willing to listen to more creative proposals, some of which may put you over the barrel to some degree. I would love to read the fine print in this private capital deal. You mentioned the interest rate of just south of 10%. That's a pretty high interest rate. At least I know I have a lot of loans that are at much better rates than almost 10%. So I'm not sure why the Big 12 schools would be willing to pay that unless they're in a place of desperation. And both the ACC and the Big 12 are far behind the SEC and the Big 10. And there are no easy answers in sight. At least the Big 12 is only, 4 years away from heavy negotiations on its next TV deals. The Big 10, the ACC rather, is still almost a decade away. You don't wait until 2036 to negotiate. That's when they expire, the ACC's TV deals. But you're 8 years away from serious negotiations about what your next TV deal will look like. We don't even know what college football will look like 8 years from now. We don't even know what the ACC or the Big 12 will look like 8 years from now. So I understand why you listen to these creative opportunities to raise more revenue so that you can spend more money and hopefully make yourself a better product. But I would show the same caution that those Big Ten and those SEC presidents have shown, because it's hard to find a private capital source or a private equity source that truly has your best interests at heart. They'll say that they do, and they also might indeed have them at heart. But I guarantee you one thing, when things go sideways, it's the private capital people that are going to get their money before anybody else does. And it's the private equity people who are going to get their money before anybody else does. Now, if you also get big money because everything went well, then everybody's happy. But if it didn't work out the way you thought on the front end, those guys never lose. And sometimes it's you, in this case, the Big 12, that's left holding a very expensive bag.
So let's tie it all together. 5 to play 5, tournament expansion to 76, the international wave of talent coming over to play American college basketball, and now private capital. And now if I'm sitting in the ACC office or if I'm in any AD chair around the state of North Carolina, I have to be asking myself, so I'll ask you to put a cap on it here, what's the strategic priority for the next 12 months? I'll stop in by saying this. If I'm Steve Newmark, I'm just trying to get to either the Big Ten or the SEC, because in my mind, the ACC has done their last TV contract. That's my opinion. I don't see how the ACC can stand alone in this regard without doing something really big. And I would bet that by 2036, the ACC will be about like the Pac-12 is right now. What do you think?
Yeah, the ACC will exist in some form, as you said. It probably won't exist in the same membership lineup that we have right now with those 18 schools, including Notre Dame, which is only, that kind of sort of partial member that has football off to the side. In the short term, you got to be a better football product, right? In the short term, you have to have all your schools paying to the maximum when it comes to that $20.5 million a year in revenue sharing, and that number does go up every year for the decade-long house settlement, remember. So it becomes more expensive every year. And in year one of that house settlement, not all ACC schools paid all the way to the $20.5 million in revenue sharing. And as we mentioned earlier, many of them also had problems really raising enough name, image, likeness money to give their coaches a good shot at competitive rosters in football or men's basketball. So one of the reasons the Big 12 is going into this private capital situation is you got to spend money to make money. It's underlying that philosophy. Well, the ACC has to figure out a way to be a better football product. Not as many people watch ACC football. I mean, you can talk about championships and those other things, and obviously the ACC doesn't have as many of them as the SEC and the Big Ten have in football. But it's a deeper-seated issue than that because the fan bases just don't watch football games in as large numbers as a whole. There are exceptions again, Florida State fans and Clemson fans and sometimes Miami fans and sometimes Virginia Tech fans. And sometimes when another school just has a great year, the TV numbers go up. You got to spend competitively to keep up with the SEC and the Big Ten. But it's hard to spend competitively because they're already making so much more money than you are. So it becomes kind of a catch-22 situation. The ACC's already moved its headquarters to Charlotte in one attempt to raise its profile and raise its revenue. But I think your bottom line is right, Mike. If you're a university that could be appealing to either the Big Ten or the SEC, someone in the room is saying, we respect tradition, we respect rivalries, we respect history, we do listen to our fans, but the financial realities are becoming so extreme, or soon to become so extreme, that we must dangle ourselves in front of the Big Ten or the SEC. We must have an internal debate at UNC or Clemson or Florida State or Miami or Louisville or whoever else thinks that they can become a desirable candidate for one of those two other leagues. I think you have to put that difficult conversation on the table while trying to raise big money, spend big money, and give those coaches the resources they need to try to win on the field and win on the court, which, of course, in the longer run makes for a more valuable TV product. Again, the problem there is the ACC is not back at the negotiating table. Even if they win more, even if they gradually attract more TV eyeballs, they don't get to benefit from that financially until almost a decade down the road. And that's a hard thing for people to swallow in ACC country right now, whether that's Commissioner Jim Phillips or any of the folks running those 18 athletic departments.
This is the North Carolina Sports Network. From the high country to the Outer Banks, on courts, fields, and fairways, we tell the stories of the bold North State. Follow us on social media at the NC Sportsnet. We're the exclusive home of The David Glenn Show, coach-driven analysis of football and basketball. A look at the past with This Was Then, Inside NIL with Court Vision, the North Carolina Sports Awards, aka the Pineys, and the Old North State Tailgate, where we are on the ground at North Carolina's top events. Our foundational partner is NC Pork, raising the bacon, raising the bar. Telling the stories of the bold North State. Experience matters. This is NCSN, the North Carolina Sports Network.